I've decided to give this house to your sister." My mother's words froze the warm living room, where Christmas carols had been playing, in an instant. The only sound left was the unnaturally loud crackle of the fire in the fireplace. Without realizing it, I tightened my grip on the carving knife I'd been holding to slice the roast turkey. This took place at my home, a brand new house I had built with $1 million of my own money, and it was the very first Christmas party I had ever hosted here. And yet, the words directed at me, the supposed host and main character of the evening, were not a gift, but an utterly unreasonable verdict. As if asserting something she had every right to claim, my mother continued, "You're single, and your career as an architect is going so well. You're always busy with work. But Kelly has a husband and a young son. That child deserves to grow up in a proper family home. This house is exactly where they truly belong." As if that were a cue, my other sisters sprang into action all at once. My older sister Sandra stood up and said, "Then I'll use the guest suite upstairs on weekends. It won't be any trouble even if Kelly's family is living here." My younger sister Ashley chimed in right after her. "Perfect. I'll take charge of the pool house. It'll be the best party spot in the summer." And then even my other sister Madison added calmly, "I'll take the study for working from home." Unbelievably, not a single one of them hesitated. It was as if they had planned this moment weeks in advance, rehearsed it over and over, everything unfolding with chilling smoothness. And then I saw it. The front door opened, and Sandra's husband walked in carrying a large cardboard box. My sisters had already arrived with their cars packed full of belongings. The invasion had been fully prepared. My mother watched the scene with a satisfied smile. "That's right. That's how it should be. We're family after all. Of course we share, don't we?" But that smile wasn't the warm expression of a loving mother. It was the face of a strategist, pleased that everything was going exactly according to plan. My success, my effort, my property. All of it was now being dismantled right in front of me under the convenient label of shared family property. I set the carving knife down on the plate with a sharp clink. The metallic sound cut through their excited chatter with a faint note of discord. Slowly, I wiped my mouth with the napkin and stood up from my chair. I clenched my hands tightly so no one would see them shaking with anger. In the living room, my sisters were already opening the cardboard boxes that had been brought in, gleefully pulling out their personal belongings, like looters inspecting their spoils. My mother noticed my movement and looked at me with a puzzled expression. "Hillary, what's wrong? Sit down. We're just about to decide together which rooms Kelly should renovate." That was the moment my last trace of hesitation vanished. Renovate? My house? I slowly looked around the room, at my mother, and then at each of my sisters scattered throughout the space. There wasn't a hint of guilt on any of their faces, only pure excitement at the prospect of acquiring someone else's property. I took a deep breath and spoke quietly, but with a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "I'll see you in court." There was a moment of silence. My mother's eyes widened, and my sisters stared at me blankly. The first to break the silence was Sandra. "Court? Are you serious? That's not funny at all, even as a joke." Ashley and Madison followed her lead, laughing. My mother let out a voice that sounded more exasperated than angry. "Don't be ridiculous. Taking a family matter to court. I've never heard of anything so absurd." "This isn't a joke," I said coldly. "This is my house. You are no longer welcome here. Pack up your things and leave immediately. This is a formal eviction notice from the legal owner of this property." This time, the air in the living room truly froze. But instead of backing down, my mother's face flushed red with anger. "Leave? Don't make me laugh. You think this is your house alone? This house is going to belong to the whole family. We have no reason to leave." "Yes, that's exactly what I wanted to hear," I murmured softly as I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. They had just refused a formal request to leave. That was all I needed. I tapped the screen and opened my messaging app. "I've been consulting my lawyer for over a week now. Everything you've done was entirely predictable." With that, I pressed send. It was the signal to put the plan into motion. "What?" My mother's face shifted from shock to fury. "You're suing your own family after everything I've done for you? You ungrateful child." "Everything you've done for me?" I shot back coldly. "So trying to take someone else's house without permission? That's what you call everything you've done for me?" I raised my smartphone to my ear. Yes. Hello, police? I asked several people to leave my home, but they're refusing and are trespassing. My calm voice echoed through the living room, replacing the Christmas music. The color drained from my sister's faces, and my mother stared at me as if she were seeing something unbelievable. The party was over. Less than 15 minutes after my call, the doorbell rang. The blinking Christmas lights outside mixed with the flashing red and blue of a police car, creating a nightmarish scene. When I opened the door, 2 large police officers stood there with stern expressions. "I'm Hillary Brown, the one who called," I said. The older officer glanced past me into the house. Inside were my mother and sisters, still clearly unable to process what was happening, and cardboard boxes scattered everywhere. "You're the homeowner, correct? And the people inside are staying here without your permission. Is that accurate?" "Yes, that's correct. They're my family, but they refused to leave when I told them to do so immediately." At my words, my mother rushed forward, shrieking hysterically. "Officer, please listen. She's trying to throw her own mother out of the house. This home was meant for her sister Kelly. It's a family house." The officer didn't react at all to her emotional outburst. He simply turned his gaze back to me. "And how do you respond to her claim?" "It's completely false," I answered firmly. "The property deed, the mortgage contract, and the property tax records are all solely in my name. I can show you digital copies right now if necessary." At my calm demeanor and the specificity of the documents I cited, the officer nodded. He then turned to my mother. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but this property legally belongs to her. Since the owner has asked you to leave, you have no right to remain here. Please gather your belongings and exit the premises immediately." "What did you just say?" My mother screeched. "You're telling me to leave my own daughter's house? What police station are you from? I'll sue you." Watching her spiral, the older officer spoke coolly. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. If you continue to refuse our order to leave, we will arrest you on the spot for criminal trespass. There will be an official record. Do you understand?" Criminal trespass, arrest, an official record. Those cold, procedural words finally brought my mother's hysteria to a halt. Her face went pale as she looked back and forth between the officer and me. In her eyes was no longer anger, but pure confusion and fear, like someone encountering a reality that didn't bend to her will for the very first time. The first person to move was Sandra's husband. In a low voice, he said, "Let's go," tugging on Sandra's arm as he reached again for one of the boxes they had just carried in. But the older officer stopped him with a raised hand. "No, leave the belongings for now. Everyone needs to exit the property immediately. We'll deal with the rest afterward." That statement made it unmistakably clear. They were no longer guests in this house, only trespassers. Humiliated, Sandra slapped her husband's hand away and glared at me. "Remember this, Hillary. Don't think you'll get away with doing something like this." She stormed out, spitting her parting threat, and Ashley and Madison followed close behind, grabbing their coats and heading for the door as if fleeing from something filthy. I could see their backs trembling with rage and humiliation. The only one left was my mother, standing there in a daze. She couldn't accept the reality that the daughter she believed she controlled had called the police, and that her perfect plan had been utterly destroyed. "Hillary," she whispered weakly, calling my name. "Why?" "I just wanted everyone in the family to be happy." "It's wrong when someone has to be sacrificed for your idea of happiness," I replied quietly. "This is my house, Mom." Those words were the final trigger. She shot me a look filled with hatred, said nothing, turned on her heel, and walked out into the blowing snow. After confirming that everyone had left the property, the officer turned back to me and handed me a business card. "You should be fine for tonight, but if anything else happens, call this number. We'll also need to speak with you at the station later about a formal report." I thanked them and watched as they left, then closed the heavy oak door. I locked it and activated the security system. As silence settled over the house, it felt unreal that chaos had filled it just moments ago. The half-eaten Christmas dinner, wrapping paper scattered across the floor, and the cardboard boxes my sisters had brought in, still sitting there, abandoned. It was the beginning of the quietest and loneliest Christmas night of my life. And yet, strangely, my mind was calm. After all, the battle had only just begun. The morning after Christmas, the house was eerily silent. Without opening a single one of the cardboard boxes my sisters had left behind, I carefully photographed each one with my phone. These weren't simply forgotten belongings, they were irrefutable evidence of a planned invasion. I had already reported everything that had happened to my lawyer, John, the night before. His instructions had been clear. Don't touch a thing, document everything. Let's see what they do next. Their next move came sooner than I expected. A few days into the new year, a thick express envelope arrived in my mailbox. The sender was one of the most notorious law firms in the city, famous for doing whatever it took to win. Inside was a formal complaint, listing my mother and sisters as the plaintiffs. As I brewed my coffee, I read through the documents. Their argument could be summed up in one word: absurd. According to them, when Hillary designed and built this house, there existed an implicit, and at times explicit, verbal agreement that it would eventually become shared family property. The events of Christmas night were a legitimate exercise of that right, and Hillary's decision to call the police constituted an illegal and unilateral betrayal of family trust. I couldn't stop myself from laughing. A verbal agreement? Really? I immediately scanned the complaint and emailed it to John. A few minutes later, my phone rang. I've read it, Hillary. This is outrageous, but don't worry, they don't have a chance. John's calm voice was reassuring. I know. I have every piece of evidence ready. The property deed, the bank loan records, my tax returns. I can prove that not a single cent, from the purchase of the land to the construction costs, came from anyone but me. That's more than enough, but just to be safe, do you think they might try to fabricate some kind of evidence to support this so-called verbal agreement? That was when I told him about my trump card. Yes, and I have proof that completely destroys that claim. To be honest, ever since construction started, I'd felt something was off about my mother and sisters. They kept casually calling it our house. And I had a bad feeling. So, for my own protection, I started recording important conversations with my family. And sure enough, last Thanksgiving, I captured something decisive. I could hear John suck in a breath on the other end of the line. I continued, "There's a recording of my mother saying this to me. The fact that you succeeded on your own and built such a beautiful house entirely with your own effort, you're truly my pride and joy." John's voice lifted with excitement. Checkmate, Hillary. I'll contact you as soon as the court date is set. After hanging up, I stared out the window at the snow-covered landscape. They had dug their own grave. In a courtroom, lies don't survive. The trial date was scheduled for late winter, just as the snow was beginning to melt. In the weeks leading up to it, my mother and sisters tried to corner me outside the courtroom. They apparently called relative after relative, as well as longtime family friends. It wasn't hard to imagine what they were saying. Hillary let success go to her head and threw her elderly mother out of the house. She's a cold-hearted woman who doesn't care at all about poor Kelly's family. We just wanted to help each other as a family. Those rumors eventually made their way back to me. Some relatives even kindly sent messages advising me to reconsider. I ignored all of it. I didn't reply. I didn't answer calls. I had no intention of fighting on their turf. At my final meeting with John, I told him about it. They know they can't win in court, so they're trying to wage an emotional war in public opinion, he said. They want to isolate you, make you feel guilty, and pressure you into dropping the case. It's completely pointless. He laughed it off. So, are we fully prepared for the evidence? Yes, everything is ready. I showed him a neatly organized list of file folders, from the property registry and building permits to bank statements, every document related to the house. Then there was the audio recording from Thanksgiving. Finally, I pulled out a single photograph. It showed the living room on Christmas night, littered with the cardboard boxes my sisters had carried in. John studied the photo and nodded in satisfaction. This is excellent, absolutely decisive. It clearly shows that their actions weren't a spur-of-the-moment argument, but a planned attempt at illegal occupation. This one image alone will shape the judge's impression. Well done, Hillary. And until the trial is over, don't touch those boxes under any circumstances. They're now key pieces of evidence. I nodded quietly at his words. Ever since that cursed night, the boxes have remained untouched in the corner of my living room, like gravestones marking the burial of their foolish plan. I looked at them every day, renewing my resolve. On the night before the trial, I sat alone in the quiet living room, sipping herbal tea. I felt no anxiety, no fear, only the certainty that tomorrow everything would be over. Under the fair and unshakable power of the law, the truth would be laid bare. The moment when my mother and sisters would finally pay the price for their lies and greed was close at hand. With that quiet determination, dawn broke on the day of the trial. The courtroom air that morning was cold and tense. Seated at the plaintiff's table were my mother and my sisters. They were dressed in modest, subdued clothing they had clearly chosen for this occasion, wearing sorrowful expressions as if they were tragic heroines. My mother, in particular, kept pressing a handkerchief to her eyes, desperately projecting fragility. Watching her theatrical gestures, I sighed inwardly. I sat at the defense table in a black pantsuit. Beside me was John, calm and composed. He efficiently organized the stacks of evidence files piled in front of him. When the judge entered and called the court to order, the plaintiff's attorney stood first. He was a middle-aged man with the air of a seasoned litigator, and he began his argument in a carefully modulated voice designed to appeal to emotion. My clients are not bringing this lawsuit out of greed. They seek only one thing: to restore family bonds. The defendant, Hillary Brown, was not able to build this magnificent home through her own efforts alone. It was made possible by the foundation of love provided by her mother, who supported and encouraged her from childhood, and by her sisters. Therefore, there existed an implicit understanding, at times even an explicit verbal agreement, that this home would become shared family property. He skillfully contrasted Kelly's family's financial struggles with my professional success, attempting to stir sympathy. In time with his words, my mother let out exaggerated sobs. When his lengthy speech finally ended and the courtroom fell silent, John rose calmly to his feet. Unlike the plaintiff's attorney, he made no dramatic gestures. He simply addressed the judge, clearly and evenly. Your Honor, we will now present not emotional arguments, but facts, supported by evidence. With that, John picked up the first evidence file. First, as Exhibit A, we submit the property registry for the house in question. The owner listed is solely Hillary Brown. Next, Exhibit B, the mortgage contract Miss Brown entered into independently with her financial institution. And Exhibit C, certificates proving that for the past 3 years, she alone has paid the property taxes from her own income. He continued methodically, presenting each document one by one. It may have been a dry procedural process, hardly entertaining, but each piece of evidence delivered a precise and devastating blow, legally dismantling the plaintiff's fantasy of shared family property. I saw my mother's shoulders tremble slightly at the plaintiff's table. This was not how their carefully imagined script was supposed to unfold. As John laid out the mountain of indisputable physical evidence, the atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift. The judge's expression grew stern, and even the plaintiff's attorney, once so confident, now showed signs of strain. Sensing the moment, John moved to deliver the decisive strike. Your Honor, the plaintiffs have consistently claimed the existence of a so-called verbal agreement. However, we possess conclusive evidence proving that claim to be entirely false. He reached into his briefcase and removed a small audio player. As Exhibit D, we submit a recording of a conversation between the defendant, Hillary Brown, and the plaintiff, her mother, recorded during last year's Thanksgiving. A ripple of unrest ran through the plaintiff's table. I heard my mother mutter under her breath, "How disgusting!" My sisters exchanged panicked glances, unable to hide their agitation. Ignoring them, John obtained the judge's permission and pressed play. What filled the courtroom was the lively noise of a Thanksgiving dinner, and, unmistakably, my mother's voice. "I still can't believe it, Hillary, that you succeeded on your own and built such a wonderful house entirely with your own efforts. I was amazed when you showed me the plans, but the finished house is even more impressive. You really are my pride and joy." When the recording stopped, the courtroom was enveloped in complete silence. Entirely with your own efforts. My pride and joy. My mother's own words had utterly destroyed, from the inside out, the story of shared family property. She stared down at the table, her face flushed red while her attorney wiped sweat from his brow. But John wasn't finished. For his final move, he took out a single-color photograph and projected it onto the courtroom monitor. "And finally, Your Honor, this is our last piece of evidence. This photograph shows the belongings the plaintiffs brought into the defendant's home on Christmas night. If their claim truly stemmed from a sincere desire to restore family bonds, why was it necessary to bring in such a large quantity of personal items, so deliberately and in advance? Displayed on the screen were cardboard boxes piled high in my living room. To anyone's eyes, it didn't look like a peaceful family discussion. It looked like a planned occupation. This was not a conversation. It was an invasion. That is all. As he returned to his seat, the judge spoke gravely. His gaze was no longer on me at the defense table, but fixed on my mother and sisters, frozen in the plaintiff's seats. The outcome had been decided. After all the evidence had been presented and both sides had delivered their closing arguments, the judge broke the heavy silence. His voice was strict, stripped of all emotion. I will now render my judgment in this matter. Everyone in the courtroom held their breath. At the plaintiff's table, my mother and sisters huddled together, their faces pale. Their attorney had already begun organizing his papers, as if he had accepted the inevitable. The judge first addressed the plaintiff's claims. The plaintiffs assert that a verbal agreement existed between themselves and the defendant, and that the property in question constitutes shared family property. However, the evidence submitted by the plaintiffs lacks any objective support whatsoever beyond the mere fact of a blood relationship. He paused, then turned his gaze to the files John had submitted. By contrast, the defendant has presented numerous legally binding documents, namely the property registry, loan agreements, and tax payment records, clearly establishing that full ownership of the property belongs solely to the defendant, Hillary Brown. These documents leave no ambiguity as to where legal ownership resides. For the first time, the judge looked directly at my mother and sisters without attempting to hide his contempt. Furthermore, the audio recording submitted by the defense reveals that the plaintiff mother herself acknowledged and praised the fact that this house was built entirely by the defendant through her own efforts. This directly and completely contradicts the plaintiff's claim of a so-called verbal agreement. In addition, the plaintiff's act of bringing a large volume of personal belongings into the defendant's home on Christmas night without her consent far exceeds the bounds of a mere family dispute and must be regarded as a highly malicious attempt at unlawful occupation. Each word landed like a nail, pinning their lies firmly in place. Accordingly, this court dismisses the plaintiff's claims in their entirety. The court hereby reaffirms that full ownership of the property rests solely with the defendant, Hillary Brown. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the courtroom. At that moment, my complete victory was sealed, but the ruling was not yet finished. The judge picked up another document and continued. Furthermore, in light of the emotional distress suffered by the defendant and the egregious nature of the plaintiff's actions, this court, on its own authority, issues a restraining order against all plaintiffs. They are hereby prohibited from approaching within a 500-yard radius of the defendant's residence or workplace, and from contacting the defendant by any means whatsoever. A restraining order. At those words, my mother and sisters froze. Legally speaking, it was as if our familial ties were severed completely. They were already utterly crushed by the restraining order alone. Yet the judge's cold, methodical reading of the judgment was still not over. He turned to another filing, the additional motion that John and I had submitted. Finally, the court will rule on the defendant's claim for damages arising from the plaintiff's trespass and the subsequent litigation it caused. At this, the plaintiff's attorney snapped his head up in alarm. Perhaps he had focused solely on the ownership dispute and underestimated our counterclaim. But John and I had prepared meticulously for this moment. The judge began to read. As a result of the plaintiff's planned and malicious trespass, the defendant was deprived of the peace she was entitled to on Christmas night and suffered significant emotional distress. Furthermore, she was forced to expend substantial time and legal fees responding to a baseless lawsuit initiated by the plaintiffs. This court finds these damages to be clear and severe. The monitor in the courtroom displayed the itemized list of damages John had submitted. It detailed compensation for emotional distress caused by the trespass, costs incurred to upgrade the security system, lost income from time taken off work to attend court proceedings, and attorney's fees paid to John. After reviewing the list, the judge delivered his final ruling. Taking all of the above into consideration, the court orders the plaintiffs, namely the mother and all sisters, to be jointly and severally liable for damages in the total amount of $150,000 payable to the defendant, Hillary Brown. Payment shall be made within 90 days of the finalization of this judgment. $150,000? The first scream came from Sandra. The amount was not the share they had fantasized about. It was a crushing, all too real debt that threatened to upend their lives. My mother opened and closed her mouth soundlessly, while Ashley and Madison stared at the numbers on the monitor as if they couldn't believe their eyes. They lost the property. They were barred from approaching me, and they were saddled with an enormous debt. This was the law's perfect judgment on those who had tried to ride on someone else's success. I watched the scene quietly, my expression unchanged. The revenge was complete. The weeks following the trial were astonishingly peaceful. I hadn't realized just how calm my life could be without the constant curse-laden messages from my mother and sisters, until they stopped entirely. The restraining order and the $150,000 judgment had become an insurmountable wall standing before them. First, I needed to deal with the relics of that cursed Christmas night. The cardboard boxes still sitting in the corner of my living room. Through John, I notified opposing counsel. Have them collected by a designated contractor within 1 week. No direct contact with Hillary will be permitted. A few days later, while I was out at work, the boxes were quietly removed. The security camera footage showed my sisters supervising the process. Hats pulled low, faces twisted with humiliation. With that, every trace of them inside my home was finally gone. Next, I upgraded the house's security system to the latest model. Not only physical barriers, but digital ones as well. Never again would my sanctuary be trampled so casually. I never learned directly how the $150,000 judgment affected their lives. But what John later told me was beyond anything I had imagined. To pay the damages and her own legal fees, my mother was forced to sell the house she had lived in for years and move into a small, aging apartment. It seems my sisters, too, have been draining their savings out of fear of asset seizure, spending their days blaming one another for what happened. The false unity they displayed in court collapsed the moment the money ran out. Even the relatives who once criticized me changed their tune after learning the truth of the trial. Now, I hear that no one is willing to stand by my mother and sisters anymore. As their world slowly fell apart, a new light began to shine on my life. The outcome of the trial was reported, briefly but with a touch of irony, on the local news. Architect nearly loses home to greedy family, wins decisive court victory, read one headline. That article triggered an unexpected surge of requests to my architectural firm. We want someone like you. Someone with the strength to fiercely protect what's theirs, to design our home. Ironically, the very house my family had tried to take from me became my greatest advertisement. Then, toward the end of that year, a magazine arrived at my door. It was Architectural Digest, the world-renowned architecture magazine. Across a full spread were stunning photographs featuring my home. The living room I had poured my heart into designing. The guest suite my sister had wanted. The pool house another sister had set her sights on. Every space shone there as proof of my creative triumph. The article described my philosophy as an architect and called the house a fortress that embodies the unshakable spirit of its owner. That Christmas, I hosted a party for my true friends in my warm home, protected by a state-of-the-art security system. Holding a champagne glass, I gazed into the fireplace and listened to my friends' genuine laughter. There was no false praise anymore. No hidden jealousy. I had lost some things, it was true, but what I gained was far greater. Peace, dignity, and complete control over my own life. In this castle I built with my own hands, I was finally able to begin a new life. Truly and fully. I raised my glass and murmured softly, "Merry Christmas." The best Christmas of all. Mine and mine alone.